everybody. My name is Suzanne Clary. I'm the president and interim executive director of the J Heritage Center, and I'm so happy to see such a robust attendance on such a gorgeous day when you could be out, raking leaves or picking apples. Instead, you want to learn about American history, diplomacy, and the making of the presidency with two of the top scholars in the field. Please help me welcome, on the right, Lindsay Chervinsky, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. She's a presidential historian and the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon, favorite site of ours. She's the author of the new acclaim-winning book, Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents that Forged the Republic. Dr. Chervinsky received her BA in History and Political Science from George Washington University and completed her master's and Ph.D. from the University of California, Davis. Previously, she was a historian at the White House Historical Association and a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University. You're getting the theme here. Presidential. Yes, the timing is purposeful. She's also the author of the award-winning book, The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution, and co-editor of Mourning the Presidents, Loss and Legacy in American Culture. You may have seen her writings before in the Wall Street Journal, Ms. Magazine, the Daily Beast, the Bulwark, Time Magazine, you name it, USA Today, Washington Post, just everywhere. And she has spoken most recently on this book tour at Montpelier. Am I pronouncing that correctly? I'm not sure.
Montpelier.
Montpelier. I'm learning too. Monticello, the National Archives, and the Museum of the American Revolution. She's recently made appearances on Morning Joe, right? That was a big one. PBS and CNN, just to name a few. We're also excited that Hamilton scholar Professor Joanne Freeman, class of 1954, professor of history and American studies at Yale University, is back at JHC. We figured it's been about 8 years since we last talked about dirty, nasty politics. She's a leading expert in early American politics and culture and the author of the award-winning Affairs of Honor, National Politics in the New Republic, and editor of Alexander Hamilton, Writings and the Essential Hamilton. She's particularly well known for her expertise, as I mentioned, in dirty, nasty politics. Her most recent book, The Fields of Blood, Violence in Congress and the Road to Civil War, was a Lincoln Prize finalist and New York Times Best Book. It explores the impact of physical violence in the U.S. Congress in the decades leading up to the Civil War. And Professor Freeman co-hosted the popular American History podcast, Now and Then, if you've ever heard that, with Heather Cox Richardson, another notable historian. She hosts a weekly webcast, History Matters, that uses history to better understand our politics. Also, a frequent commentator that you may have already seen on PBS, NPR, MSNBC, and a contributor to the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic. She was also the president of the Society for Historians of the Early American Public from 2022 to 2023. So let's dive into the book that we're going to hear more about today. It was reviewed in the New York Times. Historian and lecturer Ted Widmer, author of Lincoln on the Verge, 13 Days to Washington, reviewed the book and called it a timely account. He praised how Professor Chervinsky deftly probes the way the second American president wielded power. Adams was our nation's first vice president and prevailed in his election race against Thomas Jefferson, but not without difficulty. Both during and after his campaign and his transition to a new role, he was assailed by opponents who challenged his authority. Nonetheless, his presidency was very successful. And he set numerous precedents. It's something we're going to talk about, those precedents that he set. He survived pejoratives, diplomatic quagmires, and attacks to his principles to complete a term of confidence and consequence. Whitmer writes, "It is healthy to be reminded in another precarious moment just how fragile democracy felt during the twilight of Washington's presidency." So sit back, enjoy this timely conversation, We ask that you hold all questions until after the program. And with that, could you please give me a round of applause for our two.
Thank you very much. Is this on? Yes. Thank you. Okay. So it's my great pleasure to be here, and partly because I'm very happy to be here talking about Lindsay's book and to be here with Lindsay, partly because John Adams is a fascinating character, and I think, actually, you can tell me if you agree, he might be the only founder with a real sense of humor. I believe he is. He's very human. And thus really fascinating to study. He's kind of self-confessional. And so in a way, what I would love, since I have loved the time I have always spent with John Adams, maybe you can start by giving us a sense of the man and who he was and sort of how you met him, what you think of him having lived with him for however long it took you to write that book.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I know that fall weekends like this don't come around very often. So I appreciate your Sunday afternoon sacrifice. And I'm thrilled that we can be here together to talk about this book. So I think John Adams is tremendously fun. He is so full of life, and he did have such a sense of humor, especially about himself. He was incredibly self-deprecating and very aware of his own flaws and willing to poke fun at them, which I think shows a certain strength and perhaps bigness of his spirit. He was obviously brilliant, but and deeply read and widely read. He would sometimes write in his diary what he would do on the farm during the day, and how many rows of corn they would plant, and then what volume of Cicero he was reading at night when he was done with his farm work, which sometimes makes me feel like a slacker.
That's one does in the founding period, right?
Yes, absolutely. I think his personality was characterized by a few things, and what he brought to the presidency was characterized by a few things. So first, he cannot be separated from his New Englandness. He was from many generations of Puritan congregational stock. He had a real pride in that history, but he also was a man of humble origins. He had to work hard. He was successful, but he was never super wealthy. And that was a distinct and important contrast between him and Washington and him and Jefferson. And he knew it. And I think that cannot be removed from the equation. The second piece was he was an extraordinary diplomat. That doesn't always mean he was successful. He and the French didn't really get along very well. He found them very annoying, but his experience abroad was essential in shaping his expertise, his knowledge, and his pragmatic, realistic approach to world affairs. And most importantly, the role the United States played in it. The last piece is Abigail. John cannot be understood without Abigail. And that is partly because we have their correspondence. So when George Washington died, Martha Washington burned their correspondence at his request. So we don't know that side of him. And it was not uncommon for that practice to take place. Abigail asked John to burn their correspondence, and he was disobedient. Thank heavens. Because that's where all the snark, all the grudges, all the humor, all the love, all the affection, all the self-awareness really comes out. And so we see him in 3D in a way that we rarely get to see, I think, the others.
I have to add to that just because it's been my experience in the years that I've worked in history. Letters to wives are the best sources you can possibly have. It's only in letters to wives that particularly political characters admit their fears, and that's particularly important, right? What they're scared of, what they really want, what their innermost thoughts and feelings. And so the fact that John Adams is writing to Abigail, so not only is she a wife, but she herself is really politically brilliant. Is quite something that we have those letters.
Now, there is one exception. Theodore Sedgwick is a major player in the book, and his letters to his wife could not be more boring if he tried. They're like, here's what the weather was today. Here's who I had not even really here's who I had dinner with. I went to Congress. I miss you. But then he would write like these amazing letters to his friends. But that says a lot. I'm like, oh, okay, so you didn't like your wife.
Well, that's what I was about to say.
And that's
what does
like
this say about his marriage?
Well, it meant that I didn't like him very much, but to be honest. But you do bring up a really good point that, I mean, not only what are letters to wives so revealing, but because Abigail was such an incredible intellect and was recognized as being an incredible intellect by a lot of their peers, they were apart a lot. So we have that correspondence where if you're living together, you're not writing those letters. So they really are a treasure.
Now, you started out, in a sense, by talking about some of the things that Adams was particularly talented in. So I wonder if you could talk for just a moment about why you thought he was, or wasn't, maybe a little of both, suited for the presidency. And it's obvious, but it's worth stating, right, that he's only the second. And George Washington is on his own planet when it comes to the founders in that era. So in a sense, he's a first kind of president. Mm-hmm. And that makes this, as part of what I think we probably both love about this period, is the improvisational nature of it. Mm-hmm. The fact that it's so new, and that's some of what I'm sure you're going to tell us about Adams. But so tell us a little bit about the ways in which he was or wasn't well suited for the presidency at that moment.
Well, I like how you put it that Washington was on another planet, because that type of it's hard for us to wrap our mind around how unparalleled Washington's stature actually was. That's the type of rhetoric that usually historians actually kind of avoid because it sounds like hyperbole. But it was real, and it meant that when he stepped down from the presidency, there were real fears that the presidency wasn't going to work for anyone else, that the departments wouldn't function, that the powers of the presidency couldn't be entrusted to anybody else, that foreign nations would try and trample all over the United States if Washington was not at the helm. And that fear to us is a little bit hard to grapple with because we know what happened, but they didn't. In their context, what they were seeing was the French Republic crumble into the Reign of Terror. And so they were petrified at this first transition. And that brings up, I think, one of John Adams' most important contributions was that he did have this firm and committed belief in the experiment that they were trying to create, but he also had a deep stubbornness and a willingness to be unpopular if he felt like he was doing what was right. And that was essential because he knew that whoever came after Washington was going to have a terrible time. Anyone that came after Washington was going to be criticized either for not sticking closely enough to Washington's model or for trying to stick closely to Washington's model and falling short. And so that stubbornness, that independence of spirit, the willingness to sort of stay away from being a party man, these were essential qualities that made him extremely well suited for this particular moment and this position at this particular time. His diplomatic experience was essential because one of the main questions was whether or not the United States was going to go to war with France. And so having a knowledge and experience with many of the courts in Europe was really just a quality you could not buy. Where I think he fell short was that he had almost every position one could have in public service, except for an executive position. He had never been governor. He had never been president, and he did not sit in on a single cabinet meeting during Washington's administration. Washington kept him out of the cabinet. So he didn't have any experience managing men. He had experience working with them, negotiating with them, dealing with them on committees, but never instructing them. And so I think that he believed that the cabinet would be loyal to the president because it was the office, not understanding the essential interpersonal connections and relations and manipulations and the various things that were required to actually make it work.
I love the way that you put that, because the fact that there weren't real precedents for what they were doing, they could look, I mean, one of the fascinating things about this period is that they would look towards England, of course, which is where their political culture and heritage came from, but they would constantly ask all the time, does that mean we should do something like England? Or does that mean we should do something like England? Because they didn't want to be monarchical. They didn't want a king. But that leaves a big hole as to what they should be doing. And Washington, as we've both now said, filled that in a really distinctive kind of a way, particularly by being the man who constantly gave up power. Now Adams, for better and worse, just as you said, walks into that space and is helping to define what the presidency is when it really still doesn't have a definition. So what do you think was his understanding of what the presidency was? You know, I think George Washington spent a lot of time trying to prove he wasn't a king, and knowing that every single thing he did set a precedent. What's your sense of how Adams thought about the office?
So I think in a lot of ways that Adams actually really agreed with Washington's vision of the presidency, a lot more than either of them ever truly appreciated. I think if they could have just sat down and have a little bit of a chat, heart to heart, they would have actually realized how much they were on the same page. I think that they both believe strongly in the importance of a firm and strong executive, what they would call an executive with energy, which meant someone that could act quickly and decisively in the moment of crisis or chaos, because Congress was almost always out of session when anything interesting happened, and you needed someone who could respond quickly in that moment of crisis and act with vigor to enforce the laws that had really been the problem with Congress during the Confederation period. There was no one person that could kind of make things happen. So they believed in that. They believed that the president needed to be the decisive force when it came to foreign policy and diplomacy in particular. But they also believed in congressional oversight. They believed that Congress should be a partner in the governing process and that Congress was the main legislative body. So they were not what we would think of as advocates of what is now referred to today as the unitary executive theory. That was not their conception of the presidency. Where I think Adams was trying to figure out his way was how to ensure that Washington's vision of the executive continued for other people. Because Washington's powers were never really challenged. They were never really checked. His decisions never received the same sort of pushback that Adams would. And so many of his fights throughout the 4 years he was in office was trying to defend the character of the executive as Washington had embodied it, but for other people.
And it's worth noting along the lines that you just said, you know, if you think about the founding period as a whole, if you think about our Constitution, if you think about our early politics, it's all about power, right? And the founding generally was grounded on the idea that we have to think about responsible ways to divide power. And that was partly checks and balances that I think we still all learn about in school. But very much their main focus was channeling power. What do we do to channel it, to check it? Because the revolution, in a sense, was about a government that they thought had too much power. So, and the presidency, obviously, was an office that there was a lot of fear because the president could be a king and everybody made that sort of connection. So, and he, as you just put it, Adams is in a tricky spot because he has to preserve the office and he's never going to live up to George Washington. So what does he do? Now, you write about in the book some of the norms, some of the precedents, even before we get to elections, which we will, some of the norms or precedents that he set in this, with this mindset that everything George Washington did is going to be seen as, like up high standard. He has to keep the office respected, and he somehow has to put his stamp on it. So what were some norms he put in play that accomplished those things?
So there were three big ones, which I know we'll talk about in more detail, and I'll get to those in a second. But then there were also a lot of very small things that he was recognizing that what worked for Washington was not going to work for everybody else. So, for example, George Washington had the fanciest coach in all of North America. It was cream-colored with gold trim. And for those of you that have a white car, you know what happens when you take the white car out when it rains. Now imagine doing that with a carriage when you don't have running water or sewage or pavement. So it was a demonstration that you either had enough wealth to own the labor to clean it every time or to pay for the labor to clean it every time. It was an extraordinary statement. John Adams was not going to get away with a cream-colored coach with gold trim. So he had a slightly more modest coach that was pulled by fewer horses and was not as flashy. He did not accept a military escort when he went to his inauguration because he was not a military man and he knew it. But he's kind of just like bringing it down a notch in various different ways, not really breaking with Washington's precedent, just making it a little bit more humble. But then he also continued with certain practices that were the expected norm in places like Versailles and the Court of St. James and Washington's presidency, including wearing a dress sword, which was considered to be the thing that was done in a formal setting. As a side note, I can't find John Adams' dress sword. It's like the one question I was not able to answer. I don't know where it is. So if anyone has it in their closet,
I mean, and I have to say, I don't mean to interrupt you,
Yeah.
but the image of John Adams,
yeah, in
who
dress
is
sword.
really not a military-looking figure, wearing a dress sword.
Yeah. Well, and so I'm totally digressing here, but if anyone has seen the portrait of John Adams by William Winstanley from 1798, it's the first sort of real presidential portrait, and other than Washington's, and it's terrible. It's awful. It's absolutely ghastly. And the reason it's terrible is because they basically put John Adams' head on George Washington's body. The body is the same as the portrait from Washington's military portraits. The background's the same, everything's the same, including the dress sword. But it's a great depiction of how they didn't know how to visualize a president other than Washington. They didn't know how to visualize a presidential portrait other than the way that Washington's was done. So he's trying to figure out some of those practices and set those norms and customs. But the big three really were: he was instrumental in establishing the first two peaceful transfers of power, long before the practices of transition were written down in statute, and they are not defined in the Constitution. He defended and fought against attempts to minimize the president's role in foreign policy and ensure that the president is indeed the sole voice. And he established the president's primacy over the executive branch, including the power to fire a secretary, which we'll talk about, I think, a little bit more, is really essential because it had not been described, it had not been determined by law, and that power was very much theoretical because Washington had never fired anybody. And that actually sets the character of the executive, as we were talking about.
Why don't we actually talk about that now? Because I think that's a great example of his personality and his character and his sense of responsibility. And as he started out by saying, the fact that maybe he's not the smoothest in dealing with others.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I should start by asking, are there any Pickering descendants in the room? Okay, great. That's going to make this conversation a lot easier. So Timothy Pickering was probably the all-time worst Secretary of State ever. He was very dispositionally poorly suited to the office. He thought he was the smartest person in the room all of the time, despite being in the room with some of the greatest minds in American history. He thought compromise was a moral failing, and anyone who disagreed with him was a bug to be squished. So not really what you want as your top diplomat, as a general guiding rule. He also believed that he should be in control of foreign policy, and at times undermined Adams' foreign policy, tried to prevent some of his nominations from getting confirmed in the Senate. He was, by the end, completely outwardly insubordinate. And if I have done my job correctly, by the time John Adams fires Pickering, you will be cheering because he's very annoying by the end.
And you should mention these are inherited.
Yes, thank you. Excellent reminder. So John Adams did not have, to your point, there was no precedent of cabinet secretaries giving pro forma resignations. It just wasn't done at the time. There was no precedent of selecting your own cabinet secretaries. The only thing that John Adams knew was that George Washington had had a really hard time finding replacements because the cabinet secretaries were not very prestigious positions. They were poorly paid, and they were really hard jobs that meant you were going to be away from your family for often months at a time. He also worried that if he replaced them, it would be seen as a rebuke of Washington's judgment, or it might fracture the political party. And he was really trying hard at the beginning of his presidency to kind of hold everybody together in this sort of bipartisan, unified system. By May of 1800, that had gone terribly. The cabinet was completely fractured. His administration was fractured, largely over foreign policy. And Adams had clearly decided at some point he was going to make a change and sort of backed into it in a not particularly glorious way by picking a fight first with Secretary of War James McHenry. And McHenry asked to resign, and Adams gave him permission to do so. And then he wrote a letter to Pickering and said, I would like to make a change. I'm giving you the option to resign, which was an honorable exit. Resignation was totally honorable. And Pickering said no. He said, I would like to stay in office until the end of your term. And so Adams wrote a letter back, no salutation, no thank you for your service, just basically you're fired. Not those words, but you are removed from office. And then for good measure, he changed the locks on the Secretary of State offices. But what happened next was very important because then he submitted the appointment of John Marshall as Pickering's replacement to the Senate. And the Senate thought about it and decided that anyone else other than Marshall was going to be a worse replacement. And so they accepted that nomination. And that meant that for the first time, they had tacitly accepted that the president has the right to remove someone without any other participation. Constitution doesn't say that. Constitution barely mentions the department secretaries. The legislation creating the department secretaries does not specify how they are to be removed because Congress couldn't agree. So instead of writing something, they just didn't say. So it was very much theoretical. And so when Adams established this precedent, it confirmed the president's right to remove people who were insubordinate, to remove people who were pursuing different agendas. Imagine if we had an executive that wasn't able to do that. That would mean that we have much more of an executive by committee, almost like the British cabinet, where each secretary has their own sort of political base. And it would make the system of executive government look wildly different.
And that's a crucial thing to think about when we're talking about some of these things that sound maybe as though they're trivial or small or specific, is that a lot of the things that we're talking about, a lot of the things that Lindsay and I write about, these are things that could have fundamentally changed the nature of the government. It was so improvisational. It was so experimental. It's when I teach this period, I have a hard time exaggerating the degree to which they truly didn't think it would last because it was so experimental. I often quote a letter that someone wrote in 1790, so the government's only been operating for basically a year. And it's a throwaway line in this letter. It says, if this government lasts another 5 years, here's what we should do. So that's the assumption. And I mention that only because that even better highlights what people like Washington and then Adams, the fact that they're setting precedents, but at the same time that they're doing that, they are on this, stage that's cracking beneath them. They're afraid it's going to fall through. That really, for me, the emotion and improvisational nature of it and the intensity and the fraught nature of this period makes the politics that much more interesting.
It does, and I think it also helps explain why when they are talking about decisions, they talk about the impossibly high stakes. And to us, it can often sound hyperbolic or overly dramatic, but that's because we know that it worked. We know that it survived. They didn't know that. And so I almost overemphasize when I'm talking about this period the global context because Americans were very aware of what was happening across the Atlantic because the United States was this tiny baby little nation that did not have a whole lot of power and very much was buffeted by the whims of the French and the British, which meant that they had to pay attention to what the French and the British were doing because it was going to impact their economy. It was going to impact their livelihood, their day-to-day existence. And so when the French Revolution devolved into the Reign of Terror, and then, this is the part that I think Americans don't often know as much about, came out of the Reign of Terror and then had a series of constitutional coups where they basically threw out a directory and had a new one and revised the Constitution and threw it out and had a new one. That was what they were worried about was going to happen. Not necessarily guillotines in the streets, although sometimes they were very, very much concerned about political violence, obviously, field of blood. But they were also worried that the constitutional system would crumble and that would lead to instability. And so the fear and the tension was pervasive and the political violence was pervasive. So they sometimes had really good reason to feel this way.
Adams is actually, in this period, in his old age, there's a great correspondence between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, ex-presidents. It's wonderful. In their old age, just, talking about things like the top 10 founder funerals or whatever it is that they're that they're talking about. But he talks about the late 1790s during his presidency and how frightening it was and how there was violence and there were people on different political sides in the street being violent towards each other. And he says to Jefferson, because Jefferson, of course, says something like,
"Oh, it wasn't that bad. It
no,
was fine."
the American spirit is always in line. And, the sort of optimistic Jeffersonian way of saying things.
Sometimes I feel like Jefferson didn't actually meet people. Like he was like, humans are great. They're always going to do the right thing. And I'm like, have you stepped
He
outside?
saw things how he wanted to see
Yeah.
things. He saw things how he wanted to see things. But Adams is saying to Jefferson, really? Like, really? It's not how I experienced it. Let me tell you about the people in the street. And this is a direct quote. He says, "What think you of terrorism, Mr. Jefferson?" And that's his word for the violence in the streets. Now, he's relating it. He's referring to the French Revolution. But that gives you a sense of how it felt to many people at the time.
Well, and so those letters in particular were talking about a riot that took place on a fast day in the spring of 1798, and the mob basically gathered outside the president's house. And there were clashing mobs, both sides. There were Federalist supporters and Democratic Republican supporters. And this is before the president's house had a gate. There was no Secret Service. And John Adams was so worried about it because it was right outside that he sent his clerks and the men in his house to the War Department a couple of streets over to bring back guns and ammunition. And they were standing at the windows ready to defend the house because they thought people were going to come in. And then the sort of the city guard came and broke it up and it was fine. But, for all Jefferson downplayed it later, he wrote in a letter the next day, it was not safe to go outside last night. So in the moment, Jefferson knew what that fear was like.
Now, this is a perfect segue into what I want to talk about next. And in a way, this is a key part of Adams and what he did and the precedents he set. It's what makes this book so timely in this particular moment. And that is the presidential election of 1800. It was a highly fraught election in which candidates tied. The election was thrown into the House. They had to vote 36 times to break the tie. The atmosphere was crazy. There were people arming themselves in case they might need to take the government. I mean, people usually don't know much about that election. Actually, I have to give John Jay a moment here because I actually went, because this is where we are, is the Jay homestead. So he actually offered a statement about how he was experiencing the lead up to the election and will attest to the timeliness of history ever and always. Jay writes to a Federalist named Rufus King in June of 1800, quote, "The political world appears to be in a strange state everywhere, nor is the moral world in a much more eligible condition." He's talking about basically, what is going on? Like, what's going on? This is crazy. Now, tell us a little bit about Adams sort of heading into this election, what he's thinking, what he's facing, and the choice that he makes.
So by the time the election really sort of kicks off, the Federalist Party has split pretty decisively between the more extreme wing, which I call the Arch Federalists, and the more moderate wing. And Adams had the support of the moderate wing, who had been in favor of his decision to pursue diplomacy with the French. The Arch Federalists, which were really led by Alexander Hamilton and Timothy Pickering and Theodore Sedgwick, they preferred to pursue a more militant policy against France. They had really wanted to maintain this new expanded army, which was basically working as a spoils system for the Federalist Party. and it helped with their election prospects. So the party was very much split, which led to what we might call today an enthusiasm problem among Federalist voters. And as they went to the polls, it became pretty clear that basically the voting took place over, it was basically 8 weeks. So we think our elections are bad, but they cast votes for 8 weeks because each state was permitted to set their own election date. And the final state cast its electoral college votes on December 3rd, and that was South Carolina. And when South Carolina established or set its votes, it was clear that there was a tie between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, who were the two Democratic-Republican candidates. And this was because of a loophole in the Constitution that didn't have electors casting votes separately for vice president and president. You cast 2 votes, and the top 2 people were supposed to win. And by practice, both parties had basically established a gentleman's agreement about who was supposed to be the presidential candidate and who was the vice presidential candidate. But it was not written down. So this tie is made clear. Everyone expects Burr to say, oh, no, I'm the vice president. I'm not the president. Jefferson is the winner. Burr did not do so. And so from December 3rd until February 11th, when Congress was going to certify the votes and start the voting in the House of Representatives, that left basically 3 months for the Federalists to get up to no good. And they got up to no good. They started coming up with a series of schemes to figure out how to put someone else into the presidency, starting with, could they make Burr the winner because he might be a more malleable president. He might be more willing to go along with what they wanted if they swung their support to him. If that didn't work, they were thinking about how they could postpone any sort of result until after March 4th, which was the inauguration day at the time. And they could either put in a temporary president or maybe call a new election, and that temporary president could run as the incumbent. In response, the Democratic Republican governors of Pennsylvania and Virginia gathered their militias on the state borders, and they were ready to march into the city if someone else became president. A mob gathered outside the Capitol and threatened to kill anyone who accepted the presidency that was not Jefferson. And at the time, the French minister wrote back to Paris and said there were 100,000 people in the streets. Now, 100,000 people didn't fit in Washington, D.C. at the time, so he was exaggerating slightly.
A lot.
But I think it gets at his mentality. And Albert Gallatin, who was a Democratic Republican in the House at the time, said that he believed the threat of violence was real.
Can I just add something? That I don't mean to naysay Jefferson. I got my Ph.D. at UVA, so
I love naysaying Jefferson. Go ahead.
I do sometimes, but I always have a little tinge. There's a letter in which he's talking about this fact and the fact that people are getting militias and they're ready to essentially take the government for Jefferson. And he says in this letter, and this will be a bad paraphrase, "We have let it be known that their actions will be resisted." He essentially says, Federalists know if they try something funny here, we're prepared to respond with force. That's amazing.
Quite a statement.
And it really, I'm going to let you go on in a moment, but really people don't know about this election. I think historians existing in the current moment, think about, I have talked about this election more than I ever thought I would talk about this election in my life, fraught presidential elections. But go on and get us to...
Well, and the reason we don't know about it is because then once the Democratic Republicans were in office, they tried to sweep a lot of this violence talk under the rug because it was not particularly becoming of small r Republicans. So Adams was in the White House at this point. It was called the Executive Mansion at the time. He read the Constitution. The president has no role. The president has no role in this process. The House is to cast the votes. The Senate certifies them. Then they send him the results. But the president has no role. He's not going to call up the army because the army is controlled by the Federalists. He doesn't have control over the militias, that the state governors have those. And so he does something that we don't generally celebrate in presidents, which is he practices restraint. He invited Jefferson over to the White House. They have a series of private dinners. He said to Jefferson that he believed he was the rightful winner. He believed that the American people would get their wish, that the House would eventually sort of come to its senses and make him the rightful winner. Abigail introduces him to a bunch of the staff in the White House, such that if he is the ultimate winner, he knows who he might want to keep on as staff in the space. And Adams said that he will have nothing to do with the Federalist plots, and assures Jefferson that he will not participate in another election. That is a remarkable thing to do. And then as the voting takes place, and critically, the way that the voting works at the time is each state gets one vote. So it's not how many members you have, it's how many state delegations you control. And that's true today too. That has not been changed in the Constitution. So it doesn't matter which party has a numerical majority, it matters who has the state delegation majority. So as the voting takes place, it takes place over several days. In the first 24 hours, they cast 24 ballots. They finally decide they need to take a break, to take a nap and get some food. They come back. They go over this several days. Eventually, a compromise is brokered in which a couple of the moderate members from Maryland and Delaware sort of come up with an arrangement, which I define as civic virtue, because they're putting the Constitution above their own personal and political interests. These were young 30-something, early 40-something congressmen, many, their names are not really remembered by history, but they did this extraordinary thing. And then once Jefferson was selected, Adams set the tone of what the transition was supposed to be. He sent him a letter telling him what was in the stables so he wouldn't have to buy more horses. He instructed his cabinet secretaries to cooperate and help Jefferson, to basically give him what we would think of as briefings, so that he would know what was happening in foreign policy and in the Naval Department. Some of them even stayed on until Jefferson had his administration in place. None of that was required. None of that was written down. And then when he went home, so he lost, and he went home, he wrote a letter to Jefferson that said, "Everything looks peaceful here. I wish you a safe and happy administration." Setting the tone and the precedent for what we hope all transitions will look like going forward.
And that truly is, given everything that we've both said about how fraught and violent these times were and how none of this is written down. You know, if you think about our Constitution, it's skeletal. It's so brief. The assumption was things would be sort of created or crafted or understood once it went into motion. So what you've just described is remarkable that he made that kind of decision. But now we've talked a lot, and I want to give you folks a chance to ask some questions. And Suzanne, I think, is going to call on folks if you have questions.
Thank you so much. First round of applause.
I should say that, and I think you probably feel this way too, the question and answers are always my favorite part, because I want to know what you want to know more about, and I want to be able to give that information to you. So please don't be shy.
Right in the back there, Emma.
Hi, I'm French, and I just watched the acclaim, which I thought that was a good thing, but really different aspect for him, for Adams. That was really not the way he was shown, I would say, in the my question is, I would say, historical perspective. Why is there 3 months between the vote and the swear in? Because in Europe, it's 2 weeks or so, and just go home.
It's a really good question. So let me first say the Franklin series, I listened to an interview with the producer. The Franklin series the story is told through Franklin's perspective. So that is how Franklin saw Adams. Really important distinction. So the reason it was initially so long was because the voting took place over such a long period of time. It took a while for the returns to come in from the different states. At this point, it took weeks for news from Georgia to get to Philadelphia. And then it took weeks for news of the results to get from Philadelphia to, Western Kentucky, to allow people to know who had won and who had lost, and then to make arrangements to travel to Philadelphia, to be away from their homes for months at a time. So that took a bit. And it took then a while to travel that space. So there was a long period, and the roads often were horrible. So there was this huge buffer built in just to accommodate the change in technology and information and how long it took for news to travel. After a series of pretty bad transitions, most importantly being the 1932 transition when the Great Depression was in full swing and FDR couldn't do anything about it, we did amend our Constitution to make it slightly shorter. So now, of course, Election Day is the first Tuesday in November. Is that how it's described? It's the first Tuesday after the first, whatever. You know what I'm talking about. The election is on Tuesday. You better have voted or vote on Tuesday. And then the inauguration is on January 20th. That's still a really long time. And the reason it's a really long time is because the president appoints so many people. And it takes a really long time to select that many people. It's probably kind of a baddie system. And I think I speak for a lot of people who sometimes wish it was 2 weeks.
And actually, I mean, it relates to what you just said. Transition, right? That there has to be, some of that transition happens once a new president is in office, but some of it is happening in that, and it's a really good question, because yeah, it's a really long time, but there's a lot happening in that window. And in the early period, it takes so long, as you just said, for information to travel. That makes sense. But now, in a sense, what's filling that gap is the complications of the office itself.
Do we have any idea whether Adams, if he had it to do over again, would have appointed his own cabinet officers instead of relying on what he inherited from Washington?
That's a good question.
It's a great question. He almost certainly would have. He came to really detest some of his cabinet members, and once he was able to appoint his own, loved working with them. So his first cabinet secretary that he appointed was the Secretary of the Navy once the Naval Department was created. He loved working with Benjamin Stoddert, who was the first Secretary of the Navy. He did actually have a good relationship with the Attorney General that was left over from Washington's term. And when John Marshall became his Secretary of State, they had a phenomenal working relationship. So if he had been given a mulligan, he absolutely would have done it.
Did he ever express any regrets about not having done that?
Not in so many words, but he had particularly Adams-ish things to say about the people that were left in his cabinet. So, and it is notable that most presidents learned from that example, with a few exceptions, like Andrew Johnson kept Lincoln's cabinet, and that did not go well. And so most presidents learned that this is what you want to do. You want your own people in office.
Since Adams was the first vice president, did he do anything to develop a role for that office?
This is a great question. So John Adams called the vice presidency the most irrelevant office ever created by man, which is not actually the worst thing that vice presidents have said about the office. At the time, it was expected that the vice president would sit in on Senate sessions. So he sat in on the Senate sessions every single day. He was told to keep his mouth shut after participating enthusiastically the first session. So he didn't say anything. He just sat there. And he, until Kamala Harris last year, held the record for the most tie-breaking votes. But because Washington excluded him from all of the cabinet meetings, he attended all of the social events at the president's house, but had no actual effective governing role.
There were, I mean, and it's actually a reminder of the fact that so much was taking place in personal interaction and behind the scenes. He was present at a lot of key dinners, right? So Thomas Jefferson liked to keep track of, had dinner with so-and-so, so-and-so and so-and-so were there. And then sometimes he would actually record the conversation, which is wonderful for historians. And so through that, we know that John Adams, in that sense, is in the political circle. But yeah, it made him crazy. Because he really, you know, he was well, a person who liked to talk.
Yeah.
He was.
He was also very intellectually curious. So when he would finish his Senate session, he would go to the local bookstore and read books in like 5 different languages just to try and like make his brain work because he was so bored.
He wanted to contribute. And so on that level, you have to feel for him a little bit. He's like, wait, what?
Horrible.
I just sit here?
Oh,
Really?
Horrible. It would have been horrible. It would have been horrible.
Question with the 1800 election, my understanding was always that it was Hamilton working behind the scenes that really decided that Jefferson, even though Hamilton hated Jefferson,
was going to win that election.
I don't know. Are we going to agree to this? I don't know if we're going to agree. That'll be interesting.
That they had the duel, that was really because he caused Burr to lose the election. So I'm curious, how was the relationship, because now you're mentioning a thing with John Adams that didn't really come in, is that he just stepped back and said, you guys fight it amongst yourselves?
We're going to tag team this one. So
We may disagree.
yeah.
I don't know.
Well, I'm definitely going to leave the dual part to you. But so I actually think that Hamilton's role is overstated in the resolution. Oh, we agree. Fantastic. Always a good thing when you agree with the Hamilton scholar. I think that his role is slightly overstated, and it was slightly overstated because he had written a pamphlet about John Adams in October of 1800, really saying he was not fit to be president, but I guess we kind of still have to vote for him because he's the Federalist candidate. And it made him, he lost a lot of his political, not all, but a lot of his political influence in that moment because it made him look erratic and untrustworthy and vain. Things he accused John Adams of being. And so there's no doubt that he certainly spoke out against Burr. And for someone like Marshall, John Marshall, who hated Thomas Jefferson, who was his cousin, when Hamilton wrote and said, you cannot support Burr, Marshall said, okay, I won't support Burr, but I cannot speak out on behalf of Jefferson. So I think his influence was probably around the margins. But in terms of the actual compromise, I don't think that Hamilton had that much of a role, but I'd be curious to know.
We actually agree. No, so Hamilton, for sure. I mean, can you imagine his whole life, he's opposing Jefferson and Burr, and now one of them is going to be president. This was like his nightmare come true. And given that choice, he likes Jefferson because, as he puts it, he's so eager for public opinion to like him that he's not going to do something really dramatically bad, whereas Burr, according to Hamilton, has no morals. He do whatever he wants. He's a power opportunist. So he does frantically write letters all over the place, all kinds of Federalists in Congress. He was a writer of tomes. These long, I mean, I'm thinking originally now in print.
Could have used an editor from time to time.
No, that actually wouldn't have worked really well, given we're talking about Hamilton. But even in print, these letters are 3, 4, 5 pages, which means I don't know how many pages they'd be in manuscript form. Again and again and again saying Burr is not fit for this office, Burr, and all of the reasons why, and then having to figure out a way to say vote for Jefferson, which is really hard for the guy who's kind of made his career on opposing Jefferson. There's a letter in which he's like, yeah, he's a hypocrite and he's dangerous for this and that and the other thing, and you can't trust him with power. But he probably won't do something really bad, vote for Jefferson. So the letters themselves are mostly anti-Burr. But when you actually look at the letters he's writing and the responses, and more importantly, the responses of the people who are receiving letters and talking to each other, they're all basically saying, yeah. You know, he doesn't have a lot of power at that point. He wrote the Reynolds pamphlet and then wrote this pamphlet attacking John Adams, so he is a man without discretion, as they put it at the time. So yeah, he has not a lot of influence. So people like, and it's partly because of the Hamilton musical. Oh, and the fact of the matter is that Burr and Hamilton almost get into a duel, an affair of honor, at that point, and it gets explained away. The actual duel is 4 years later, and it isn't related to this election. But anyway, yeah, so we are actually in agreement. Hamilton wanted to have that kind of power, but he really didn't.
We're talking about the vice presidency and how it changed it. Thomas Jefferson was sort of a subversive vice president, was he not? Trying to undermine constantly the president during his tenure. When did we finally figure out that we should have both of them from the same party?
Excellent question. So, yes, Jefferson was incredibly subversive and comes remarkably close to treason, actually. He was meeting with the French minister during Adams' presidency saying, don't sign a treaty, meaning continue to seize American ships, imprison American sailors, go ahead and do that. You will get a better deal when I'm in office in 3 years. Had there been a declaration of war, that would have counted as treason. In terms of when we realized that having a vice president from a different party was a really bad choice, it was during this period of time. So the amendment, the 12th Amendment, which was passed in 1803, changed how people voted. And it made it clear that the president and the vice president were basically on one ticket. And so you would not then have a president and a vice president from two different parties. In terms of how the vice presidency has evolved, it is worth noting that there was not an office of the vice president. Like now, today, there's an official office of the vice president until FDR's presidency. The first vice president to have any real influence was Walter Mondale. I think the way we think about vice presidents as sort of a partner in governing was really a creation of Dick Cheney. So we are talking about a very, very modern evolution of this office.
Also, just a quick response as well. Your question highlights the fact that when they started the government, they did not assume that there were going to be two parties banging against each other. The idea that you could have a party that's national and organized in any way, so that fact that you end up with John Adams, a president of one party, vice president of another, is a sign of the fact that the politics did not end up working out the way they assumed it would, and party politics takes over eventually, and they learn that lesson.
Which is not to say that they thought everyone would get along. They did not have that assumption, but rather that I think the best way to think about it is that they thought there would be a lot of different factions that would morph and change depending on the subject. And so you would build together these coalitions depending on the moment and depending on the issue that you were trying to decide or to regulate, and that's how people would form sort of governing coalitions, which is not all that different from some of the parliamentary systems that we see in Europe today.
As historians, you guys have access to, obviously, to diaries, to public documents, and so on. I'm curious to know what, if any, what constituted public opinion in those days, and how do you, as historians, in a period where there was no Twitter, find out what people were thinking? That's basically the question.
Well, it's an excellent question. Thank you. It is a little bit difficult to get at because not everyone was leaving written records, which is, or even having conversations that would have then been documented in writing, which is a lot of the source material that we have left to us. There are a couple of different ways we can get at it. So newspapers are a phenomenal source because lots of people are writing into them, not just necessarily the people like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, but other people are writing into them as well. How they are circulated and where they are circulated does tend to suggest how they are shared. So we know that newspapers at the time were often either people would cut out snippets and mail them to people, and then letters and newspapers were read aloud, or newspapers themselves were sent to places like taverns and local, what were sort of like what we would think of as sort of roadside inns, and people would read them by the fire to people who were coming through who either didn't have access to the document or couldn't read. Letters were a very essential part of social fabric at the time, and they had very important distinctions on what they would write at the top of the letter about who the letter was to be shared with. So if you didn't write anything, that meant that the letter could be shared. And you could read it to your family, you could send it to your friends, you could share it, and in that way we could see ideas start to circulate. Sometimes they would write, private and confidential, and that would mean you would only share it with maybe a couple of people that were sort of in the know. And then sometimes they would say, like burn after reading, so only you are to see this letter. But sharing the letters, sending the letters, copying sections from the letters, that was a really essential part at the way that ideas got around, which is an imperfect science at getting at public opinion. They didn't have polling. They were trying to kind of do their own straw poll through letters, but it is very fuzzy and it is very difficult to assess.
And I want to touch on the newspapers as well, because you're right. There's a silence, right? Elite people save their papers, or someone saves it for them, and we know what they think, and the average person, not so much. Newspapers in this period are shaping the public discourse, and each newspaper pretty much is controlled and shaped by an editor, and many, well, pretty much all political newspapers are very partisan. So you don't necessarily know what the man on the street thinks, but you definitely know the ideas that are circulating in the air. And every once in a while, you come across something. There's one case that involved a murder that I worked on many years ago in Massachusetts and Boston, and it involved an honor dispute. And in a newspaper, two men were exchanging insults back and forth and back and forth. And ultimately, one of them, or actually the son of one of them, shot and killed the other in the street, like in the middle of Boston. The reason why we have a sense of what the public thought about that is that they called in at the trial anyone who was there and saw it. There's like a barrel maker and a barber, and they just called in everyone in the street. And what they all say, for me, this was great evidence. What they all say is, well, I saw the newspaper, and these are just average citizens. Well, I saw the newspaper, so someone was going to do something violent to someone. And so some of them actually came to the street and stood there to wait for it to happen. Now, as far as public opinion goes, that says a lot about what's trickling down and what the public assumes. But that was like a lucky stab. But it's a great question, and it's a huge question, right? Because our government is grounded on us, the public.
Well, and they, like, as we're trying to put sort of parameters on how you would figure it out, they were doing the same thing. Like, they were constantly trying to figure out what was public opinion, because they were trying to figure out basically like what their job approval rating was, and were struggling to identify it as well. And so like Washington would write these letters to people that lived in different states saying, send me reliable information. I want to know what the people are thinking, which I love because they knew how important it was.
And people would go and deliberately hang out in taverns and listen to conversation and then report back to the leaders, oh, well, this is what public opinion is. And again, because no polling, there's no telling what they're gathering. There's one case in which someone reports to James Madison public opinion in Virginia about Hamilton's financial plan, and the public opinion is, well, people are willing to give it a go. And Madison says, wrong public. They talked to the wrong public.